We have two awesome speakers. Actually, I know Jamie for a while. I don't think I've met Mike, but I know you worked with Tim and the other folks over at MITRE. And of course, if you've not heard of MITRE, it has been mentioned like 28 times today. And of course, part of the attack framework, among other things. So what do we have? We have a talk titled, "Which Came First, the Phish or the Opportunity to Defend Against It?" I really like this because I work very much in assumed breach, right? But we still need to know what happens to gain that initial access. And MITRE has evolved. I'm sure you're going to talk about it, from the pre-attack to now part of attack. And MITRE does always evolve. And you all are just amazing folks to work with and collaborate with. Jamie Williams, his Twitter handle says antisocial, but he is not antisocial at all. You can see him running some of the MITRE attack conferences and emceeing and whatnot. But you also do adversary engineering, as does Mike, who is the cookie wanter, but does not tweet. I think today we need to get your first tweet out there, Mike. I think that today is a day for that. So without further ado, turning it over to you all, please take it away. We'll be back for some Q&A after your talk.
Such kind words, George. Always a pleasure. The people's champ. And also, Eric, every day I try to learn something new that I can improve on. Apparently that's dad jokes. I love what you're doing there. And big shout out to Sans for having us and hosting us. Obviously everyone, Corrigan, Jennifer, everything you guys do, everyone behind the scenes. Big shout out to Gert Jan, bringing the energy, getting us really hyped up and jazzed about doing this. But like George said, we're always looking for a place to improve, get better. And our big question for the day, and kind of what we would have talked to you about, was, how do we move to the left? How do, like George said, we're big on assume breach, post compromise, all of that's very important. But is there things that we can do and kind of learn about what an adversary does before they exploit you, like left of exploit? So we're hoping this is something that you can definitely use in your defensive work, as well as it's an opportunity to help us and help each other. So we're really excited about this talk. As George covered it very well, my name is Jamie Williams, one of the leads for MITRE ATT&CK, but also attack evaluations. I actually come from a more network background, did a lot of work, kind of a sysadmin kind of stuff, started in Intel analysis, a little bit of work there, got into offensive and kind of grew from offensive to red teaming to purple teaming. Love it. Opened up a lot of doors for me. So everyone in that new to purple channel, just keep pushing, keep asking questions. It'll take you places, very interesting places that you probably shouldn't be, but if you're there, you belong. So definitely, keep learning, keep growing. And I'll turn it over to the notorious to introduce himself.
Hey, Jamie. My name's Mike Hartley. I'm also one of the leads on MITRE ATT&CK and formerly worked on evals. These days, I tend to do a lot of cyber threat intelligence work, and also formerly have an operational blue teaming and red teaming background in different roles.
Awesome. So big, what are we talking about today? And we said this a couple of times, but the big question we asked ourselves is like, where and when does cyber defense start? Is it when your SOC has a red dot on their dashboard? Is that when you kind of engage, or is there things that we can do before that point? Because we know adversaries do things leading up to that point, but how do we defend against those? In the spirit of everything we've talked about this entire summit, if we understand these behaviors, how do we actually, inject them into the way we perform assessments, inject them into the way that we defend ourselves, and inject them into our normal thought processes in terms of, just typical cyber defense. So we actually had a lot of fun kind of opening this up, and hopefully it resonates with you, but also there's some opportunities for us as a community to grow and keep sharing ideas. So we're really excited about this one. Just for a little bit of context, we said this a couple of times already, pushing things to the left, left of exploit. So just kind of clear up what we're talking about here. A really good way to kind of highlight this is the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. What you can see here is a notional kind of flow of an incident or a breach or a campaign. Starting from the left, an adversary is going to do, reconnaissance. They're going to figure out, who they want to target, how they want to target them, weaponization, getting their payloads, getting their C2 set up, getting all that stuff situated. Delivery, this is going to be, pushing, either spear fishes or however they plan to get their payloads into your environment. And then from there, we have the exploitation, all the post-compromise activity. Leading up to actions on compromise or objectives, which is typically, them exfilling stolen data, encrypting your files, whatever their reason for doing this campaign or breach was. But really, our big question was, a lot of cyber defense focuses on, that right of exploitation. So once they're in your environment, you can kind of see them operating, writing analytics to detect them, hardening systems to defend or mitigate against those behaviors. But really, what we wanted to kind of unpack was, what does defending left look like? Is there certain trends that we can do to figure out, what our adversaries are doing in that space? Or as practitioners, is it something we just kind of have to accept and kind of just understand we really can't engage an adversary until the exploitation point? So kind of open-ended research question there that we wanted to dive into and see what we can do as in the spirit of growing and always being a little bit better. So like George said earlier, we previously had an entire matrix of attack focused on what we called pre-attack. So, as you can see, had, full scope and spectrum of attack, the tactics, the techniques. It was really great. And actually, it's still available on the site if you wanted to go and still check it out. There's still some use cases there. But as of late last year, we merged that into enterprise. Big objective there was exactly as we're talking about today. We wanted to be able to see those behaviors and see those techniques in the context of the rest of attack, being able to see how things like, all of those pre-behaviors spill into initial access and beyond. So shout out to the team that did this. They did a really great job kind of scoping, how we're going to do this merger specifically. And in the context of what we're talking about today, the parts of pre-attack that end up merging into the rest of an enterprise attack were things that were technical and visible to some defender. Exactly the kind of things that we would want to know about as an enterprise defender that we can potentially do something about. So you might be asking yourself right now, why do these pre-behaviors matter? If it's not in my environment, it's not in my network, why do I care? Valid questions. And I think this really taps into one of the big themes of our talk today is cyber threat intelligence. It's not necessarily vital that you kind of track adversaries outside environment. Obviously, you can get by really well without doing that. But there's also a lot of yield on keeping an intel tab on your adversaries. Particularly, there might be some things that they're doing that kind of show their hand. Specifically, are they getting ready to target you? And also, how are they going to go about that? Is there kind of things that they're doing that might show exactly how they plan on, fulfilling or actually executing their campaign? So it might be, advantageous to see, are there things that you could potentially capture and collect and maybe analyze in order to, they're a little bit of giving a head start if they're able to do all these things before you notice them. So maybe you can meet them on that, that temporal curve and see what you can do about it. So just kind of showing you where all this looks like now. This is our pride and joy attack. So if you're not familiar with this, I know it's mentioned a couple of times already, but attack is a knowledge base of adversary TTPs based on real world observations. So we're documenting real behaviors used by adversaries. So we have tactics, techniques, all the way down to procedures or specific implementations that adversaries have used to achieve a particular goal. So if you are a big follower attack, you might have noticed last year the attack matrix got wider. Particularly, we added those new tactics that captured those pre-behaviors. Specifically, we had the reconnaissance tactic, which was gathering information to help plan or kind of scope future operations. I like to think of this as, pre-compromise discovery. So they're not necessarily in your environment, but they're outside your environment, trying to gather, information about you, whether it's technical, whether it's about your personnel, whether it's about your business, maybe touching your environment lightly, like doing some scanning, some phishing probes, things like that. But they're not necessarily, this isn't initial access. They're not actually dropping any code in your environment, executing and establishing C2. The other big tactic here is resource development. So this is kind of aligns with that cyber kill chain weaponization phase where, they're getting their infrastructure ready, they're getting their C2 set up, they're compromising, requiring credentials and, accounts, and they're also, developing their malware or, in other cases, we've seen adversaries steal malware and, repurpose it. So just kind of, this is the kind of that first step to answering these questions is, okay, now we actually have an understanding of what these behaviors look like. Now we can actually start to have a little fun. So just giving you a little bit more context of what these pre-behaviors look like. So in the spirit of attack, they're full techniques. And if you don't remember anything else about attack, biggest thing here is we're not just documenting an adversary playbook for the sake of telling adversaries and hackers what to do. We're trying to connect these adversary behaviors to defensive countermeasures. So this is what and how adversaries do things, and this is what we're going to do about it. So specifically, we look at this technique, compromise accounts. This is an adversary, rather than say I wanted to, phish Mike, I could, typo squat and make a bunch of fake credential or accounts and try to send him lures, or I could try to maybe compromise a real account and actually send him payloads from a real account. So in this case, we've seen adversaries do this. We have documentation of this happening. So this technique exists, whether it's for social media or email addresses. But also you can see on the bottom, we do have mitigations and detections for this. And that's kind of actually one of the tails and kind of the leads for this entire talk was, very often this isn't going to happen in your environment. If my Gmail or my Twitter account got hacked, God forbid, I don't know who's really responsible for that. Is the SOC supposed to step in and defend that? And what does that look like? What type of data sources are available there? What type of analytics? What does that actually look like? And in what phase of a campaign is it even possible to know what that's happening and actually defend it? So we wanted to, unpack this a little bit and, tease out, specific examples of how we can actually, practically defend this. And that led us to the conclusion, really great solution to a lot of problems is this purple teaming. So we decided, hey, let's use what we know about adversary emulation and understanding adversary behaviors and executing those, combine that with purple teaming, actually taking that knowledge of adversary behaviors, executing it, and seeing where the data falls and what we can do about it as defenders. With the big goal of, let's stop giving these adversaries a head start. Let's figure out how far left can we go, understand traceable, detections and data that we can actually find, and push that into the way the SOC, or your defenders think about defending, your enterprise. So we ended up doing a couple emulations and purple teams of specific behaviors. We scoped that down to 3 lessons. So we'll walk through those now. First being, this is beyond even just, pre-behaviors. Use your purple team to extend beyond attack. Attack is a really great starting point in terms of intelligence and, the understanding of the adversary behaviors and the defensive countermeasures, but, you need to make it your own. There are things, specific conditions, whether they're about the adversary behavior or the defensive things that you can do that are going to be your own. Your data collection might look a little bit different. A specific adversary behavior might tease out different data. So you really need to, where possible, do this type of experimentation, or at least, walk through these type of considerations, and really kind of like make it, as practical and as actionable as possible. So to kind of highlight this point, we chose an example of some intelligence that we had or found about adversaries performing a pre-behavior. In this case, we're looking at APT29 SVR doing some active scanning. For anyone who's an Exchange server admin out there, I know it was a rough 2021. We definitely sympathize. There's a lot of little vulnerabilities and problems in that space. But let's use this as a lesson to grow, learn, and see what we can do about it. So in this case, we have the adversary doing some scanning. Not a lot of details on how they're doing the scanning, but we can actually use this. This is enough of a starting point to identify what we need a purple team and what we actually need to assess. So starting what we have with attack, we can look at the data source and detections to kind of start thinking about, as from our blue side, how do we actually defend this? So attack gives us really good guidance here about, potentially collecting network traffic, active scan network traffic that makes a lot of sense in terms of connecting those two, but also the detection, particularly a lot of scans are going to have unique metadata. A lot of scans will have, potentially coming from known infrastructure associated with the adversary or botnets, other things that we can kind of start to do to identify, hey, this isn't just normal traffic. This is some type of, malicious adversary behavior. Okay, so we got a good starting point. Now let's keep going. So, other big principle here is we don't, from the red team perspective and being a good purple teamer, let's not just sling exploits. Let's actually understand our adversary behavior, actually understand, what's happening so that we can be better in terms of communicating how to actually defend it. So in this case, the particular CVE that they were scanning for is also very commonly known as proxy logon. This is, quickest way to describe this is an unauthenticated user could send a malformed packet to a server. the server processes it and actually performs some action on behalf of that unauthenticated user. So ideally, that shouldn't happen. And if you read the links there for the report, but there's a lot of creative ways an adversary could use this, dropping malicious files to that server's disk, potentially executing malicious commands. But long story short, this is something that we don't want happening. And if you look deeper into the CVE, it's particularly related to 2 cookie types. So these Exchange servers would parse these cookies, and based on the cookie values, make some type of request internally in their environment from some unauthenticated unknown user who just happened to send a packet over. So this is the fun part. Let's get our hands dirty. So as soon as I saw active scanning, I immediately thought Nmap. I was like, that makes sense. And luckily enough, Microsoft actually published a Nmap script to actually perform this type of scanning. So the link's there if you want to check it out. The part that really matters and interesting, as you can see here, we're setting those cookie values in order to kind of facilitate that proxy logon, that request forgery. So personally, this is an area where I typically get stuck. I am terrible at IT. If you wanted me to stand up an environment, this talk might have been ready for next year's summit. But big shout out to OTRF, button click. Once I got my Microsoft quotas set up, we were able to quickly deploy a range. It had, Active Directory already installed. The domain was set up, had an Exchange server, pretty easy. So definitely recommend, where possible in this purple team process, try to use open source resources to be able to get those infrastructure things. Because I think we talked about this earlier in the summit. Sometimes you can do things in prod, pros and cons in that. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. But where they are possible, don't let that be a roadblock for actually doing experimentation. So lab experimentation does apply to the real world if you know how to parse it over and scope it. But long story short, able to do my scan, did the scan over typical ports, 80 and 443, and surprise, surprise, the Exchange server was vulnerable. So stopping here, not doing any exploitation. Let's just see at this point in the breach, was there anything that we could have potentially detected to kind of see an adversary, not even throwing the exploit, just trying to figure out, is it possible? So going in, putting on our blue hat, expectation, yep, looking for network traffic and network traffic flow. And as you can expect pretty easy, found the GET request, cookie values there. That's pretty much exactly what we expected. It's kind of, we sent a packet, we saw a packet, good. But big question here is that the best data source? Is that the best way that as an organization, we can actually detect that? In some cases, it might be, if you have great PCAP, if you do that kind of parsing, might work out really well for you. But in this case, maybe there's an Exchange server that's internet facing, gets a lot of traffic, maybe not doing full PCAP inspection is not reasonable, encryption, that's a pretty lengthy string to kind of parse for. There might be various reasons this might not be ideal for you. So big question was, is there a better way, using this experimentation as kind of a catalyst, is there a better way that we can actually detect this? So I had no idea what I was doing. This is another great opportunity to expand a purple team, bring in an admin. I was poking around. I figured Exchange has a bunch of logs. There might be a way Exchange log this in some capacity. Quit a couple of times. I was like, oh man, this slide is not going to be great because I'm going to have no, kaboom, but eventually found it. You think I would have found it earlier based on the name, but Exchange does have this HTTP proxy logs file. Long story short, I think the name's almost intuitive. I don't really understand what's in this log, but it seems to be logging every time it does some type of proxy on behalf of an HTTP file. Without even looking at it very deeply, you can see one of those lines looks really different than the rest of them. So unpacking that a little bit, you can kind of see that line is pretty much exactly what we're looking for. So starting at the bottom, you can see this proxy was based on the cookie. And interesting enough, that log is pretty fascinating. It's kind of, the way I interpreted it is, it's the external IP of the Exchange server making a request to localhost, but that request is unauthenticated. So that in itself is really bizarre. So digging deeper into this and figuring out, hey, is this something that a typical Exchange admin would actually see? Funny enough, around the same time that the proof of concept for the CVE came out, there was a bunch of forum activity from admins asking, what are these logs? What are these errors? I don't understand what's happening. So immediate ROI from a purple team back to these admins and back to the organization saying, that data is really important. It's actually, these mass scans from various actors trying to exploit our environment. And here's how we can connect, what admins are seeing to what the red team's doing back to our blue team and actually be better defenders. So just summarizing that, definitely use the magic and the power of a purple team to push attack into your environment.
Awesome, thanks. So another lesson is that the red team can emulate left of exploit behaviors that will create observables, and that those observables the blue team can then use to uncover the underlying approaches the adversary takes to carry out those left of exploit behaviors. So right here we see some acquire infrastructure domains activity from an APT1 report. And some things you can cue in on here are like the themes, like technology related themes, 1 or 2 words concatenated together, similar registration information, things like Shanghai or the registrant email with Ugly Gorilla, and other features you might be looking at, such as who the registrar is, like Namecheap or name silo, or when the domain was even registered. And when emulating the adversary, the red team can leverage CTI to acquire infrastructure or even make mistakes in a similar fashion to the adversary being emulated, such as like a PDB path linking samples that you seeded in VirusTotal. And this should be done without using the exact same indicators from threat reports. So don't try to register these APT1 domains. Rather, use the behaviors you discern from CTI as the red team to do these left of exploit behaviors as faithfully as possible. Similarly, if the adversary is very OPSEC aware, make sure you're emulating that faithfully as well and sever linkages between different components of your infrastructure if that's the type of operation that needs to be run. So on the blue side, you can conduct pivot analysis based on those observables, such as a registrant email address to defend left. And we would like to give a shout out to a great SAN CTI talk and subsequent white paper by Joe Slawick. One of the major takeaways being that as you piece together the threads connecting these observables from this left of exploit behavior, you're revealing underlying adversary behaviors that bind them and are causally responsible for the links you're observing between those observables. So this leads you to come to a better understanding of the adversary behaviors beyond the particular observables, which can aid in the tracking of unreported indicators. So you start to understand habits, for example, in how an adversary acquires infrastructure, like what infrastructure do they rely on, where do they get it, how long do they get it before they use it in operations, any conventions, and how those change based on the target. So here's just one example. We can kind of go through this quickly of a sample of malware we used in an adversary emulation exercise, and questions come up like, what else did they sign with that Gmail address or infrastructure they used with it? What services are listening on that C2 server that you might be able to pivot on, and even using creation time to help scope your inquiry. So many of us are, this is a third lesson. So many of us at the summit are familiar with purple teaming as a mechanism to like validate defenses, identify gaps, and refine defensive processes. But one lesson we've learned from sort of purple teaming to these defend left behaviors is that there's a slightly different emphasis on what processes you end up validating and refining. So namely, more emphasis on improvements to the cyber threat intelligence process in your organization, including identifying strengths and weaknesses with respect to collection, visibility, and analytical approaches to that adversary recon and resource development behavior. So testing here helps ensure good practices are in place for that integration of the cyber threat intel function to the rest of the SOC, including like collaboration and communication, eliciting insights such as how actionable and timely are the go-betweens between your threat analysts or malware analysts if those are separate teams. And yes, above all, have fun doing it. So this is a method for identifying strengths and weaknesses to continually mature your defenses. So one approach might be to use a red team informed mock notification from a threat sharing partner that gets sent to the blue team at the start. And for example, some bits of information can be in that mock notification, as well as maybe a sample of red team malware or a domain that they purchased. And that way the blue team can get started sort of uncovering features related to that sample and start pivoting. But in all, we should continually refine our processes to instill good habits for real world engagements with the adversary. So there are some limitations running through just very quickly. The rules of engagement, scope of emulated behaviors, threat intel gaps, and timeline. These are things like for the scope, for example, that sometimes you can't legally emulate all these behaviors faithfully, like you can't compromise third-party servers for infrastructure the way that the adversary you're emulating is. So there's creative workarounds there. And moving on to overall lessons, I'll pass over to Jamie.
Yeah, so like I said before, like in summary, we do curate attack. We know it's not, the silver bullet to solve all problems, but we have the resources to extend attack to, address these hard problems. Particularly in this case, we can use what we know about adversaries' behaviors before compromise, like particularly pre. We can look at these pre behaviors, use our intelligence to prioritize how we should assess these behaviors, but also what behaviors to assess. So like looking at that example, we can look at, hey, this type of scanning is really relevant for us. Let's bring that into our environment and actually, purple team that and figure out how to make these defenses really ours.
Yep. And we've learned that by analyzing observables, we can discern underlying adversary behaviors as they're preparing for targeting. And that by purple teaming left of exploit behaviors faithfully, we can improve our defensive processes and overall align with purple teaming practice. We're looking to mature defenses and instill good habits that are going to pay off when we engage with the adversary for real on their terms. And so somewhat selfishly, what do we still need? Attack is growing and evolving, and its success is, of course, driven by the security community at large. So please feel free to reach out to us with any contributions you may have to the knowledge base, including those concerning detections and data sources for identifying adversaries as they conduct reconnaissance or they develop the resources they use to support targeting. And with that, I'm Mike Hartley. And
yeah,
thank you.
Jamie Williams. I think
Yeah.
do we have a little bit of time for questions perhaps? And if not, we'll definitely appreciate everyone's, time and attention. We'll hop in Slack, definitely banter back and forth there. But hopefully, like Mike said, this is something that's useful for you. But also, like if you're, purple teaming these behaviors, definitely shoot us an email. We can help, help grow attack, fill out that content, and make it something that everyone can kind of, make use of. So, big thanks for hosting us again, and look forward to collaborating.
Thanks.
Awesome,
it's always very impressive to see people from MITRE talk. It's you're in my view as I'm also from across the pond, right? So I'm a bit further away, but it's directly from the source. So I do appreciate it. There were quite a few questions, but I think most of them actually got answered by people who are pretty active in Slack. So I'm just scanning through it to see if I see anything left. But I think we got all of the questions handled. Do you see anything, George? I don't think so, right?
There is one, but it's very specific. I don't know if you'll know off the top of your head, maybe some. So there's a question here of how much would using a reverse proxy, using something like a small Nginx instance, help to mitigate recon resource development and initial access for an Exchange Outlook web access server?
I don't know how much it would be relevant for resource development. Maybe for recon, if you're talking about parts of that tactic where the adversary is actually engaging with you, thinking like vulnerability scanning, active scanning, ping sweeps, things like that, and then also like spear phishing. It might be a good way to thinking back to our lesson 1. It might be a good way to aggregate all of the data coming in from like network traffic. If you did need a really efficient and kind of optimized way to do that. I don't think it would necessarily mitigate it without additional control. So there might be, talking in specifics, there might be ways to kind of layer more things on top of that. But yeah, that's kind of the questions we're hoping to answer is, documenting those things and saying, hey, reverse proxy is relevant here. Sharing that with the community and saying, hey, if you do want to kind of potentially mitigate this is what you would need and what you need to do with it. So any and all those thoughts, I think that's the perfect line of questioning that we're hoping to, put in people's heads and start figuring out what we can do and to actually, spread that knowledge and make people, better at actually defending these behaviors.
Awesome, cool. And now you're going to get asked a bunch of MITRE questions, even though you might have nothing to do with the other projects, but you're MITRE. So question here from Jeff about MITRE Shield. How do you think something like MITRE Shield fits into purple teaming and things like that? Have you seen anyone use that? And I know that's a tough question since that's not what you're working on, but we got you for 5 more minutes. I'm going to take advantage.
By all means, yeah. I'm interested in Mike's opinion here too, but yeah, Shield is a fascinating project. Like you said, it's not directly associated with attack, but you can definitely see the parallels, definitely see the connections. They do a really great job documenting things. Definitely a different hat to put on, still blue, but active versus kind of the passive defense is very fascinating kind of line in the sand. So I do think there's opportunities there. It's not something we day to day that we think about, but I definitely check out Shield. Some of that might resonate very heavily with you. Might be things you're already doing as a blue teamer. You're not necessarily realizing that you're doing active defense. But there might be opportunities for you to kind of realize like, hey, based on our stacks and our processes, and like Mike said, understanding how our SOC operates, there's things that are maybe more attainable. And you can say, hey, we can already do this with our current staff and our current data, and maybe an opportunity to set goals and say, hey, this sounds really good. I understand how, based on how this, Shield technique maps to attack and behaviors, I understand how that's really valuable to us and something we want to incorporate. So I think back to your even, initial point is just, it's always an opportunity to innovate and grow. Definitely don't just kind of look at yourself and constantly think, I'm awesome and I'm doing things great, but, taking these ideas, even if they don't necessarily land, it's still a thing that can, run it through your filter and say, is there anything there that could add value back to me? Mike, was there anything you wanted to drop on top of that?
No, that was great. Yeah, Shield's an awesome project. I mean, by using something like Shield, you might be able to elicit more behaviors that could be a jumping off point to identify other resource development behaviors in particular. So by kind of using some of those sort of like active defense measures, you might be able to, on your own terms, sort of uncover things the adversary is doing that can lead to other points of information about their left of exploit behaviors that were previously unknown. And ideally, if possible, sharing those out with other folks.
All right, thanks. We have a few more minutes left. There's a few more questions in the Slack channel. If that's fine with you, I'll steal the last 2 minutes to introduce our next speaker, just to make sure that we get the timing correct. There's a few more smaller questions, I think, on Slack. Again, amazing presentation, and I actually put it on Slack as well. I was literally going to say, when you mentioned, George said there's going to be a whole ton of other MITRE questions, I thought, okay, first question on Shield, and then boom, it actually hit. So that was pretty nice. There you go. But thanks a lot for taking it. Pretty nice response. And well, talk to you a bit later, maybe. Thank you.